All right, so today we're going to tackle a pretty weighty topic.
Yeah.
It's one that I think a lot of people are thinking about these days, and it's this idea of stagflation.
Right.
Um, you know, when you hear that word, it sounds kind of scary, and for good reason.
It is. Like the economic equivalent of, I don't know, a perfect storm.
Yeah.
You've got high inflation that just won't quit.
Yeah.
It just keeps going up. At the same time, the economy is slowing down.
Yeah.
And unemployment is high.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a worst case scenario.
Yeah, and it really flips the script on how we're used to thinking about recessions or economic downturns.
Right.
Usually when things slow down, you would think that, okay, well, price pressures are going to ease.
Right.
Inflation's going to start to come down.
Supply and demands, right.
Exactly. But here you're stuck with this really nasty combination of rising costs and sluggish growth all at the same time.
All at once.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this isn't just some, theoretical concept.
Right.
I mean, we've seen this play out in the past, and it wasn't pretty. No.
The 1970s are a very stark reminder of just how much damage stagflation can inflict.
Right.
Those oil crises we hear about, the soaring prices for everyday goods, people just feeling really uncertain about the economy.
Absolutely. And that's why with all the craziness that's happening in the global economy right now,
Right.
The choppy waters we keep hearing about.
Yeah.
We thought it was really important to take a deep dive into this
Right.
and understand what stagflation could mean today.
Yeah. What are the risks? How do we think about it?
Exactly.
And that's really the mission of this deep dive, is to equip you with the knowledge.
Right.
To really think strategically about these challenges.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's break this down.
Yeah.
What makes stagflation so different from, just a typical recession or an economic downturn?
Yeah. So I think the crucial difference is that stubborn inflation that we see.
Right.
In a normal slowdown, as demand weakens, you'd expect prices to kind of follow suit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Things slow down, people aren't buying as much, prices start to come down.
Makes sense.
But with stagflation, you don't get that natural downward pressure on prices.
Right.
Even though the economy is weak, prices keep climbing.
Yeah, it's like a double whammy.
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher.
You're getting hit from both sides, and then it makes it so much harder
Exactly.
to pull yourself out of it, because the usual tools in the toolbox, the things that you would normally do to try to stimulate the economy, they don't really work the same way.
Yeah, they can actually backfire in a stagflationary environment.
Oh, right.
So that's really what makes it so tricky.
Okay, so let's look at this in more detail.
Yeah.
What are the things that are actually driving this high inflation that just won't quit?
Okay, so I think there are a few key culprits that we can point to.
Okay.
And these are all things that are really interconnected.
Yeah.
So first off, we have those supply chain disruptions that we've all become way too familiar with
Oh, yeah.
over the last few years.
Absolutely.
Think about port congestion, delaying goods or shortages of crucial components.
Right.
Like semiconductors, which impacts manufacturing, all kinds of industry.
It's rippled through so many sectors.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's one piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
Then you've got this persistent geopolitical instability,
Mm-hmm.
and that just creates so much uncertainty.
Absolutely.
To drive up costs in all sorts of unpredictable ways.
You never know what's coming next.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got rising commodity prices,
Mm-hmm.
particularly for things like energy,
Right.
which really ripple through the entire economy.
Yeah, because everyone needs energy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So all of these factors, they kind of work together
Right.
to squeeze businesses by increasing their input costs.
Yeah. So if a company is paying more for their energy
Right.
or their raw materials,
Right.
what do they try to pass those costs along to the consumer, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the natural reaction.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how you get this inflationary spiral going.
Right, because then we have less money to spend on other things.
Exactly.
And that weakens demand overall.
Yeah.
And that's part of what contributes to that stagnant growth side of stagflation.
Right, because if people aren't buying as much,
Right.
businesses are less likely to invest and expand.
Right. They're going to hold back.
Exactly. Why expand when the future looks so uncertain?
Right. And then on top of that, you've got declining productivity in some cases.
Yeah.
Which means businesses are getting less output for the same amount of effort.
Exactly.
So it's really a tough situation for businesses to be in.
Yeah, it's a multifaceted challenge.
Yeah. And it puts central banks in a really tricky spot.
Right.
They're the ones who are supposed to try to manage the economy, keep things stable.
Yeah.
But with stagflation, it's like their hands are tied.
It's a real dilemma.
Yeah, because what do they normally do to combat inflation? They raise interest rates, right?
Right. That's the classic playbook.
Right. But in a stagflationary environment, if you raise interest rates,
Yeah.
that could actually make the economic slowdown even worse.
Exactly. It's like you're trying to put out one fire, but you're risking starting another one.
Right. Because you're making it more expensive for businesses to borrow money.
Right.
Which could lead to them cutting back even more, maybe even laying people off.
Exactly.
Which would further increase unemployment.
Yeah.
So it's a real catch-22.
It is.
What about going the other way? What about lowering interest rates to try to stimulate the economy?
Yeah. So that's the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
And it comes with its own set of risks.
Right.
While lower rates might give a short-term boost to economic activity,
right,
they could also end up fueling inflation even more.
Right, because people have more money to spend.
Exactly.
But the prices are still high.
Right.
So it's like you're just making the problem worse.
Yeah, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, so we've got this difficult mix of high inflation and sluggish growth. And the usual solutions don't really seem to work.
Right.
So let's talk about the impact on businesses.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the real world. This is where the rubber meets the road.
Absolutely.
And our sources paint a pretty grim picture.
Yeah.
They talk about a challenging operating environment, which seems like a bit of an understatement.
Yeah. I think that's putting it mildly.
Yeah. So let's break down some of those specific challenges.
Okay.
What are businesses actually facing?
So I think one of the most immediate and pressing issues is increased costs.
Right.
As we've discussed, the price of energy, raw materials, labor, all of these things can jump significantly during stagflation.
Yeah.
And that directly eats into a company's profitability.
And it's not always easy for businesses to just raise their prices to cover those costs.
No, absolutely not.
Especially if consumers are already feeling squeezed.
Right. If demand is weak,
right,
businesses might find it really hard to pass those higher costs on to their customers.
Right. They might lose customers.
Exactly. They might lose market share.
Yeah.
And so that pressure on profit margins can be very damaging.
Yeah. And then, of course, you've got reduced demand.
Right.
If everything costs more, people have less money to spend.
Exactly.
And they're probably feeling less confident about the economy in general.
Right. They might be worried about their jobs.
Yeah.
They might be worried about their savings.
Yeah.
And so they're going to be more inclined to cut back on spending.
Right. Those discretionary items.
Exactly. The things they don't absolutely need.
Right. And that can lead to a decline in sales and revenue for businesses.
Across the board. Yeah.
Yeah. And then if businesses are facing lower demand and their expenses are rising, they're probably not going to be too keen on investing in new ventures or expanding.
No, not at all.
Right. Our sources talk about this as investment uncertainty.
Right, because why commit capital to new projects when the economic landscape is so unpredictable?
Yeah, you don't know what's going to happen.
Exactly.
So it's better to just kind of hunker down.
Right. Play it safe.
And weather the storm.
Yeah. Preserve your cash.
And then there's the labor market, which seems to behave in a really strange way during stagflation.
Right. It creates this kind of paradoxical situation.
Yeah. You can have high unemployment at the same time that there's pressure for higher wages.
Yeah, because as the economy stagnates, some businesses might be forced to lay off workers, which leads to higher unemployment. But at the same time, inflation is still high, which means the cost of living is going up.
Yeah, people need more money just to buy the same things.
Exactly. So workers might demand higher wages just to keep up.
Right, to maintain their purchasing power.
Yeah. And so businesses are kind of caught in the middle.
Yeah.
They're facing a larger pool of unemployed workers.
Right.
But they're also under pressure to increase wages for the workers they have.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in.
It is.
And then to make matters even worse, we've got those ongoing supply chain vulnerabilities that we've all become so aware of.
Yeah, those are not going away anytime soon.
No. And stagflation can actually make them worse.
Exactly. Because any kind of disruption, whether it's a geopolitical event, a natural disaster, a logistical bottleneck, can lead to further delays and increased costs for businesses.
And we're already seeing those delays and increased costs.
Exactly. So it just adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah. So it's a pretty daunting picture.
Yeah. It's not a rosy outlook.
But our sources do suggest that businesses aren't completely helpless.
Right.
There are things they can do.
There are proactive steps they can take
To try to mitigate these risks.
Exactly.
So let's talk about some of those strategies,
Right.
starting with cost management. I mean, that seems like a pretty fundamental place to start.
Yeah, I think that's the foundation.
Right.
When you're facing these kinds of challenges,
Yeah.
you really need to batten down the hatches
Right.
and look for any and all opportunities to reduce expenses.
Go through everything with a fine-tooth comb.
Exactly. Scrutinize every line item.
Yeah.
Look for ways to optimize your supply chains.
Right. Find those efficiencies.
Streamline your operations.
Yeah.
Improve your overall efficiency.
Become more lean.
Exactly. The goal is to really weather those rising input costs as effectively as possible.
Yeah. Okay, so you're trying to control what you can control.
Right.
What about pricing strategies?
Yeah, so this is where things get a little bit tricky.
Right.
Because you've got to strike a very delicate balance.
Right. You don't want to price yourself out of the market.
Exactly.
But you also need to cover your costs. So
Right.
how do you do that?
So you need to carefully consider how much of your increased costs you can pass on to consumers without significantly impacting demand
Right.
and losing market share.
Right.
Our sources talk about dynamic pricing strategies,
Right.
which is basically adjusting your prices in response to changes in demand and market conditions.
Okay, so you're constantly kind of monitoring and adjusting.
Exactly. You're being very flexible. And then another approach is to focus on value-added offerings.
Right.
Trying to justify any price increases by providing additional benefits or features to the customer.
Right. So it's not just about raising the price.
Yeah.
It's about giving them more for their money.
Exactly.
Okay. Another strategy that our sources highlight is diversification. And that seems like a smart move in any kind of uncertain economic environment.
It's all about spreading the risk.
Right.
So diversifying your revenue streams, for example.
Right.
Not relying too heavily on a single product or service.
Right.
Can provide a buffer if one area of your business is particularly hard hit.
Okay.
Similarly, expanding your customer base to different geographic regions or demographic groups can reduce your dependence on a single market.
Okay. Spread it out.
Exactly. And then crucially, diversifying your supply chains.
Right.
Having multiple sources for key materials and components.
Yeah, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly, because if one supplier is disrupted,
Right.
you got other options.
Yeah.
Right.
So it really helps to minimize your vulnerability.
Okay. And that's something that I think a lot of businesses have learned the hard way.
Yeah, the pandemic really exposed those weaknesses
For sure.
in the global supply chain.
Our sources also emphasize financial prudence.
Yes.
Which I think is just good advice in general,
Always a good idea.
but especially during times of uncertainty.
Absolutely.
So what does financial prudence actually look like in a stagflationary environment?
So it really boils down to maintaining a strong and stable financial position.
Okay.
So building up healthy cash reserves is really important.
Yeah, having that cushion.
Exactly, because it gives you a safety net to absorb potential losses or unexpected expenses.
Right.
And then carefully managing debt levels is also critical.
Yeah, because interest rates could go up.
Exactly, and that can make your existing debt much more expensive to service.
Right, so it's about being really mindful of your financial situation.
Yeah, and making sure that you're prepared for a range of possibilities.
Okay, what about looking ahead, trying to anticipate what challenges might be coming down the pike?
Yeah, so strategic planning becomes even more vital during stagflation.
Okay.
Our sources talk about scenario planning,
Okay.
which is basically thinking through different possible economic futures.
Right, what if this happens? What if that happens?
Exactly, playing out those different scenarios.
Yeah.
Including various stagflationary scenarios with
Yeah.
different levels of severity and duration.
Right. Could be short, could be long, could be mild, could be severe.
Exactly. And then stress testing is another important tool,
Okay.
which is basically evaluating how your business would perform under those adverse conditions.
Right, put it through the ringer
Exactly.
and see what happens.
And see where the weak points are
Yeah.
so that you can address them.
Right, so it's about being proactive
Exactly.
rather than reactive.
Yeah, don't wait for the crisis to hit.
Right, be prepared.
Exactly.
And then finally, our sources touch on the role of technology adoption. How can technology help businesses navigate stagflation?
So investing in technology can be a really powerful way to improve efficiency,
Okay.
across various aspects of your business.
Yeah.
So this could include automating processes to reduce labor costs,
Right.
using data analytics to optimize resource allocation,
Mm-hmm.
enhancing productivity through better tools and systems.
Yeah, so it's about working smarter, not harder.
Exactly.
Right.
And ultimately, the goal is to lower your overall cost structure
Right.
and become more competitive.
even in a tough environment.
Exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like while stagflation is a serious challenge, businesses aren't completely powerless.
No, they have options.
They can take steps to prepare.
Absolutely.
And to mitigate those risks.
Exactly.
As we look ahead, it's clear from everything that we've discussed that the risk of stagflation is real.
It's a real possibility.
It's something that we need to be thinking about.
Absolutely.
And so those core strategies that we talked about, cost management, strategic planning, operational resilience, they become really crucial.
They're essential.
In navigating this kind of environment.
Yeah.
The ability to be flexible, to adapt to changing conditions, to respond quickly.
Yeah.
That's what's going to separate the businesses that thrive
Absolutely.
from the businesses that struggle.
Yeah.
So while we can't predict the future,
right,
we can certainly prepare for it.
We can be as prepared as possible.
And I think that's the key takeaway here.
Yeah.
Thinking about stagflation, developing those plans, thinking about how you would respond. That's what responsible business leadership is all about.
Absolutely.
It's about being proactive.
Yeah.
It's about being prepared. It's about being resilient.
Exactly.
And I think this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
Yeah, a lot of food for thought.
In terms of our own businesses and our own personal finances.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.